Dear friends, dear colleagues, today we are starting next plenary session, and it is my honor. I am very proud to introduce you our moderator, Ms. Lara Setrakian. She is a co-founder and CEO of News Deeply, journalist, entrepreneur, and impact investor. Setrakian is a young global leader of the World Economic Forum and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She was named one of Fast Company's 100 most creative people in business and one of the Marie Claire magazine's Women on Top. So we are very proud that you are here. Thank you very much that you have found time for our webinar. And before starting, I want to give you our book, last book, which we have published recently with our team. And David Arase kindly also reviewed this book. Thank you, David, Professor Arase as well. And please, it is yours.
I have been so honored to receive it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is a terrific gift. I've been looking forward to this book since I heard about it, and I'm very glad to have a copy. Thank you, Dr. Setrakian, for the very warm welcome and introduction to this year's China-Eurasia conference. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening plenary session of Day 2 of this year's China-Eurasia Summit. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. David Arase, a resident professor at the Hopkins-Nanjing Center of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. I've been pronouncing his name in the Armenian style. I hope it's sufficiently correct. Dr. Arase is a renowned expert on the impact of China's growing role on the global stage. He is joining us from Hong Kong today for his keynote speech. Dr. Arase, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lara, and thank you, Dr. Setrakian, for inviting me. I'd like to also thank the organizers, the China-Eurasia Council for Political and Strategic Research Foundation and the Russian Armenian University, as well as the support of the Chinese Embassy in Yerevan. So today, I'd like to talk about a rather large topic, to say it mildly, that is the future for Eurasian peace, security, and development. And what does it look like at this moment? And I'll start with the panicked, disorganized evacuation of Western presence in Afghanistan last September, which crystallized the defeat of what some might call 20 years of post-Cold War US-led liberal global governance promotion, or what others might simply call US hegemonism. Whatever the name, what ended was America's post-Cold War unipolar moment. And after the dust settles, what comes next for Eurasia will be a new era of local initiative and responsibility. The task is to reconstruct Eurasian order in a way better suited to the needs and aspirations of resident nations. Now, whether this new era will be a prelude to a peaceful and prosperous Eurasia under successful governance, or a Eurasia divided by revived civilizational differences and ambitions is unknown. But this larger question is well worth considering at this watershed moment. Now, on the one hand, it could be a new era of freedom and cultural renaissance. Recall that in the Cold War, Eurasian nations turned to the Soviet Union or the liberal West to achieve modern forms of government, economy, and society. In the post-Cold War period that has just ended, they struggled to adapt to US-led neoliberal economic globalization. In other words, for roughly the past 70 years, the civilizational heritages and cultural traditions of many Eurasian peoples were largely put aside as guides to modern political, economic, and social order. But now, Eurasian peoples are freer than ever before to remove the political and ideological straitjackets of Cold War and post-Cold War geopolitics and reinvent themselves as modern nations rooted in their own ancient civilizational memories and traditions, but still looking to preserve their globalized relations. On the other hand, this new era could also be one of danger and turmoil. The inevitable end of America's unipolar moment may be seen as liberation, but the public goods it delivered, general stability, open trade, easy travel, free information flows, will weaken. If new ways of providing them are not found, the danger is that economies will not develop, life will get more difficult, and armed conflict over scarce resources will become more common. The difficulty is compounded by centrifugal Eurasian political and cultural forces that define themselves in opposition to liberal global governance. And Eurasian civilizational states will work to put themselves at the center of rejuvenated civilizational spheres of power and influence. I would say these civilizational states are today's regional powers: Russia, China, India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and somehow the EU, with Germany at its center, has to be included as well. Each power must do this to guarantee itself as much security and prosperity as possible. With the disintegration of liberal global governance as a universal norm, and in the absence of Eurasia-wide governance, this dynamic will cause each civilization state to compete with others for a favorable division of scarce resources. And in this new era of reawakened civilizational memories, the strategy and success will be measured against civilizational achievements during past Renaissance eras. As each revitalizes its own cultural identity and pursues its own interests, these civilizational states will necessarily find themselves at odds to make the problem of cooperation to provide Eurasian public goods all the more difficult, not to mention the question of how to guarantee peace and stability. And the rise of comprehensive Sino-US global rivalry complicates the situation even more. If anything proves the end of unipolarity and the idea of universal liberal governance, it is China's rise as a great power. First, China expressly challenges liberal conceptions of democracy, human rights, and the international rule of law. Second, it promotes an alternative, China-centered community of shared destiny for all humankind, in which China, with its special governance capacities and advanced economic and military development, will provide critical leadership, development resources, and security for the global community. Finally, China demands an end to Cold War thinking, or the system of US security alliances, partnerships, and bases in and around Eurasia. And any argument for a US role in managing international affairs outside of North America is labeled hegemonism. This Sino-US strategic rivalry poses critical dilemmas for Eurasian peoples that hope for a new era of peace, prosperity, and cultural renaissance. So the thesis I present here is that the end of the unipolar moment forces Eurasia's civilization states to find new paths to development and security. It also allows their dormant civilizational memories and identities to reawaken and inform their respective visions of self and world. This dynamic revives civilizational and geopolitical fault lines that had been buried under bipolar Cold War and post-Cold War unipolar landscapes. The reemergence could divide Eurasia from east to west and north to south. On top of this, there's the quickly sharpening Sino-US global rivalry that threatens to divide the world, including Eurasia, into another bipolar Cold War-like situation. The logic of great power competition tells us that Sino-US geo-economic rivalry will drive each power to use all means to guarantee its own access to critical markets, technologies, and resources. Each will seek control over critical supply chains, and each will work to exclude the rival power and its allies while rewarding its own allies with participation and access. Geopolitical rivalry will drive an arms race, cause each power to attract a coalition of allies and supporters using such material, cultural, and ideological leverage as they have. Pre-existing regional tensions can be intensified, and smaller countries that come to critically depend on the economic and security cooperation provided by one or both great powers will be forced to choose sides if or when great power turns openly antagonistic. The trigger for such a turn to antagonistic rivalry need not be Eurasian. It could be, for example, an offshore event in maritime East Asia, over which Eurasian regional powers have no control. But the consequences for Eurasia would be fateful. Now, looking to the future, there seem to be three general scenarios useful for guiding our thinking. I don't know which one will turn out to be closest to reality, but I do believe that Eurasian nations exercise a strategic choice today. And in the end, they collectively will decide which scenario materializes. First is an SCO-centered world. The SCO is represents Eurasian governance under a multilateral institution, or not yet institution, but a forum, which brings Russia, China, India, Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia together to discuss shared security concerns. This is a start. With the demise of the liberal rules-based order in Central Eurasia, the task here is to agree on the method and scope for rulemaking, rule monitoring, dispute resolution, and rule enforcement. The first great test of this approach is Afghanistan under Taliban rule. There can be no greater threat to prospects for Eurasian stability and longer-term trade and development than this question. And it provides an opportunity to demonstrate how the revival of ancient Eurasian civilizational legacies can work to unite rather than divide the supercontinent. The second scenario is the Chinese dream. Now, this scenario involves following China's vision of Eurasian governance, sketched out by the Belt and Road Initiative and the so-called Community of Shared Fate for all humankind. The struggle for global primacy that began under the banner of the Chinese dream of the great national rejuvenation gave China the incentive to promote the Belt and Road Initiative and the Community of Shared Human Fate. When it comes to membership in the BRI and the Community of Shared Fate, China will turn a blind eye to the political ideology and domestic governance practices of partner governments. It will reward political allegiance to China with financing and political favors, but it will punish betrayal by withholding them. The incentive for the rest of Eurasia to follow would be the Chinese loan-financed and Chinese built and operated infrastructure projects of BRI. This is followed by commercial provision of trade, investment, and technology, a growing Chinese cultural presence and growing cultural exchange. And what naturally follows is intergovernmental policy coordination across a broad range of governance matters, adoption of common regulations and technical standards, involvement in local cultural institutions, and security assistance via a broadened concept of BRI cooperation. The price of joining BRI is granting privileged access to China, whether as the external provider of finance, trade, technology, construction, or commercial services, or as an external political, cultural, and security cooperation partner. In due course, China's national security organs will secure Chinese trade and investment interests and will support local regime political security, while the People's Liberation Army will expand its basing and operations across the BRI footprint to secure the common development interests of China and BRI partners. In the end, it all adds up to joining China's great struggle to achieve Xi Jinping's Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. In terms of geoeconomics and geopolitics, it also means that Eurasia's civilization states will line up with China in its great power competition with the US, as indicated above. This may seem superficially attractive in the current moment, but it is a path that leads back to a bipolar world of Cold War division, if not earlier, to something like the ancient Central Kingdom's imperial tribute system, where neighbors were rewarded or punished according to the degree of respect they paid to the Chinese emperor. The third and last scenario is what I simply call muddling through. Now, this is a reasonable strategy when you face an unpredictable and rapidly changing security environment. Keep all options open, beware of deceptions, and act positively in the face of clear opportunities and dangers, while remaining independent, rational, and prudent. What this means in practice is that Eurasia's civilization states, which aspire to strategic autonomy and regional spheres of influence that match what exists in each one's cultural memory, must keep autonomy and security uppermost in mind. In the worst case, overall Eurasian order could return to the law of the jungle. This might makes right world would create a balkanized landscape of cultural conflict, historical grudges, and strategic tension. In this case, each will need one or two allies to avoid strategic isolation, and it will not be a pretty picture. A far better one would be a Eurasia where the international rule of law remains intact. I'm speaking here of UN Charter-based notions of state sovereignty, sovereign equality, legally binding agreements, adjudication of disputes before impartial international tribunals, and the notion of peaceful, non-coercive, voluntary resolution of international disputes. Though imperfect, this vision of international law represents something that all Eurasian states can affirm. And it can provide the rights and freedoms needed for each state, large and small, to work out its own national destiny according to its own best interests. And that concludes my remarks for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arase. It was absolutely fascinating. My first question is, can I audit one of your classes? Because that was so fascinating and insightful. And honestly, I know we all have a lot more to explore and develop from the things you touched upon. I invite everyone on the webinar currently, if you do have a question, feel free to type it into the chat box. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A with Dr. Arase. And I'll start with my own question. I was going to ask about how do norms get enforced, but you touched upon that with your comments around UN systems and of course others. And so essentially the one thing, if I'm being forced to choose, that you mentioned that I would love to just ask you to develop further is this need to find new paths for development and security. So from the perspective of an individual state or an individual actor, how do we further develop this idea of a new pathway? It's no longer an appeal to a single power or, frankly, not just a US embassy or a USAID, but a US period. It is something else. It is a complex equation. So could you talk a little bit about some beginning thoughts? What do new pathways for development and security look like for states in the Eurasian region who are non-civilizational states, that basically not the...
Yes, well, for those, the problem for smaller states is that their allegiance will be claimed by the civilization state that believes it has a claim on you, right? And so that's going to be a problem for smaller states. The answer to this dilemma is to choose a sponsor, choose a great power sponsor, or if there's no other alternative. But the absolute best outcome for these states is continuation of the international rule of law and multilateralism, where everybody gets a vote in how the rules are made and what agreements are made. So it's to the advantage of small countries to insist on multilateralism and the rule of law. And what you want to avoid is you hedge your risks and avoid irreversible critical dependence on one power if you can avoid that. So that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. And economically, what does that look like, you think?
Economically, what that means is that you have to keep access to global markets open. You have to be free to choose who you contract with. You can't be forced into, let's say, a user network that forces you to use only one service provider. Right? Mm-hmm. So you want to have basically a globally open trading system, investment system, information system, and not be trapped inside, somebody's splinter net.
Mm-hmm. So I sense both from some of your remarks and also just watching the I wouldn't say necessarily overlapping, but the blossoming of prominence of regional multilateral organizations, and frankly, you could say regional development finance opportunities. And in a sense, there's no conflict. You simply have more players when it comes to development finance opportunities or others. But then also you look at this from gatherings of states who solve disputes or try to set and enforce norms. And you've got the traditional old players, of course, UN, EU, and all the UN-related Bretton Woods organization. We're back to development finance, but then you have this, CSO, you have the Eurasian Economic Union, you have the Pan-Turkic platforms. And in a sense, one thing it was very interesting, perhaps the Syrian conflict was an early test of this, because you had the UN system operating, and then certain actors sort of moved part of the conversation to the Astana dialogue platform, which was, a self-selecting, powerful, influential group who in a way had all the muscle they would need to set and enforce a solution, but of course outside the original frameworks. So when you have all of these new ways of collecting powers, what does that mean for problem solving? What does that mean for stability? Could it be a net positive, or are we really just going to see competing approaches and opportunities, frankly, to shift when it's opportunistic to shift, like it was in the Syrian case? Well, it was opportunistic. It was also potentially effective. One could say it moved faster than the original bigger platforms, and it was unshackled. Maybe that's a good thing. So I just wonder your reflections on that.
Well, the Syria conflict is just one regional conflict, but what we're talking about, generally speaking, is going to be a decade of these things, right? A decade, 2 decades of these things. And so that you need a rule of thumb or a general approach. And I think it's kind of what I touched on at the very end of my remarks, and that is, if it turns into sort of a power contest or power competition between the regional powers, and it becomes a might makes right game, that's going to make governance, region-wide governance and open trade difficult. But if you're able to maintain a UN-based system where those fundamental norms are still respected by everybody, then you have a chance to maintain an open and very dynamic and creative regional process of negotiation that can produce development and that has enough space for cultural renaissance and political autonomy and sovereignty, but in a way more civilized way. So those are the choices.
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, if it does become law of the jungle, it won't quite matter which platform you use. You'll simply see more interest-based solutions rather than norms or
yes,
rule-based.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's going to depend on those regional powers to decide for themselves what they want and what they can get away with. So it's going to be a very interesting thing to watch, I think.
I remember, and there's an article, certainly I've been thinking about writing relative to the Syrian conflict as a case study. There was this moment where the US very notably stepped out, was half in, half out with problem solving, but this phrase was tossed around that we're going to outsource this to our regional allies. And you would see actually what it would mean to try to let regional powers sort of compete for ideas or compete for potential solutions on the ground. I mean, in a sense, do you think regions can sort out their problems for themselves, or are we seeing that it becomes so interest-based that you actually need a mediator?
Well, that's right. So, well, it's always good to have a sort of baseline set of norms, like international law. But, this gets to the problem posed by, Sino-US strategic competition, because it's going to, in other words, these great powers who look at the world globally, not just in terms of regions, they're in a position to, outsource or subcontract, their agendas to regional powers, and that's a danger, because that's not necessarily good for Eurasia, right? For Eurasian interests, if you want to look at it that way. So yeah, it's a difficult. In other words, we're looking at a very difficult period coming up, and I think people have to be very cautious and aware of what's at stake.
Absolutely. Certainly, there were no lack of complaints from the age of US hegemony either. Some might offer that certainly this is room for more positive and equitable decision-making or problem-solving, but as you've very, very wisely noted from many angles, those formulas have yet to be fully crafted, tested, and validated. So we thank you sincerely. We're just about out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Arase, for your keynote speech today.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here.